Okay, everybody, good to go? All right, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. All right, I'm glad that somebody laughed at that. So we're all language learners here. I think everybody here is bilingual to some degree or other. So I hope that you find interest in this presentation because I'm interested in this topic. And I learned some things from my research the past semester, and I hope that you can pick something up from this. So during my first presentation, I asked you a similar question, but I want to ask again. So would you say in your language studies you're, on the one hand, more systematic, logical, or would you say you're more organic and kind of do as you please? So raise your hand if you think you're more systematic. Nobody? How about if you think you're more organic? Okay, and about half of you didn't vote. That means you're organic. And I want to start with a short video. It's just 2 minutes, and this was directed by Parker and Stone. That's the people who made South Park. And the audio is from Alan Watts. Does anybody know who that is?
That's familiar.
Okay. Yeah, the lecture in 1969.
In the history of philosophy and poetry and art,
How do I make audio louder? So what is that?
I don't know. Could you try?
In poetry and art, we always find the interchange of two personality types, which I call prickles and goo. The prickly people are...
Okay, well, I'll just send it to you in the group chat. How about that? Okay, so the gist of that argument is that there's kind of two types of people, and he calls them in this lecture prickly people and gooey people. And there's people who disagree on what the basic nature of reality is, and the gist of his lecture is modern physics tells us that reality is neither prickly nor gooey. It's kind of depends on the perspective that you look at it. So I think we all know, and if you didn't answer, really, it's because you know that you need to be somewhat rigorous and systematic, and you need to be somewhat organic. It's really a combination of the two things. Where was I going to go with this? All right. Before I continue, is there a marker? Shucks. It looks like there's not. What is there a like a? It doesn't matter. So I was originally planning on doing the broader historical overview in the COM 6000 class and more of the research rigorous related literature review for this class. But I was just so excited to give this presentation that I didn't want to throw anything away. So I tried to mash it all together, and I a little bit ran out of time doing that, but we'll see how it goes. Okay, Is
it freeze?
Yes, what? Okay, so introduction part 1. During my research, I found repeatedly over and over again the same 3 themes come up in vocabulary research, and these are 3 sequential and simultaneous questions, and you'll see what I mean as I go along with that. And the 3 questions are: what is a word? What constitutes knowledge of a word? And what is the best way to acquire this knowledge? So vocabulary research starts with Hermann Ebbinghaus in his 1885 work on memory. And while his specific interest was in memory, he did do something related to vocabulary research. So I wouldn't say that he was directly focused on vocabulary, but as the progenitor of the whole field of research, he did kind of set the theme for what would go forward. So how did Ebbinghaus define a word? So he really avoided the question rather than answering it. But for him, a word was random syllables. So he developed these random syllables, and then he would time himself to see how many repetitions of this syllable do I need to say before I can just memorize it? And if you've ever heard the term learning curve or forgetting curve, this comes from him. So in a way, he addressed all three questions. What is a word? For him, it was just a random syllable. And what constitutes knowledge is just if I can remember these syllables, that constitutes knowledge. Okay, obviously, as I'll continue to talk about, word knowledge goes into far greater depth than just being able to spell a word or just be able to reproduce it. But also, you couldn't say that you know a word if you can't reproduce it in some way. So in a way, he did give the most basic answer to that question. And what is the best way to study? So rote repetition, that's what he used. That's the tried and true method. And there are numerous other techniques such as mnemonics, but I don't think that you can get away from rote repetition. So I think that Dr. Paul Rose actually, this is just a tangent, but I think that we saw this illusion with Dr. Paul Rose. Actually, Ebbinghaus developed this illusion. Okay, so 40-year time gap. The next person I wanted to talk about was Charles K. Ogden, and he was the pioneer of the concept of lemmas. Does anybody know what a lemma is? Okay, the word lemma comes from Greek, and it means something granted. In vocabulary research, it means we don't always talk about words, we talk about word families. So go, goes, went, going, gone. Those are considered to be a single lemma, or some people would say word families. So he didn't come up with this term lemma. In fact, it doesn't become a common term until many, many decades later, but he did describe this concept in his 1923 work, The Meaning of Meaning. And he also, his other contribution to language research was the invention of something called Basic English. So he reduced all of English down to 850 words, and his goal was to create the smallest minimal microcosm of English as a way to aid in learning English. So, in terms of what is a word, he advanced the idea with the development of the lemma concept and how to learn words. One approach to that is to minimize the number of words that you need to learn. So what do you think about that? Can you effectively communicate with only 850 words? I mean, my impression is that it's very minimal. The typical rule of thumb that you hear in language classes is you need to know about 2,000 words to be able to read a newspaper or just communicate day-to-day life. However, so here's an example of what his word list looks like. So he didn't use standard parts of speech. He called it operations and such and such. So just take a look at that. I'm not going to read everything. General words. So what these are abstract nouns, I think, just based off looking at it. And things, that's concrete nouns. Qualities, obviously, that's adjectives. Okay, so my first impression was that there's no way you can communicate with 850 words. But there's actually three pieces of evidence that demonstrate the validity of Ogden's Basic English, and one is the Basic English dictionaries. So he continued to work on this for the rest of his life, and he made these dictionaries. First edition was 10,000 words, second edition 20,000, third edition 40,000, and that was in like the 1950s. So he continued to work for decades on this, and the way that works is I'm going to give you 40,000 words, and the definition is going to be given only derived from that list of 850 words that constitute Basic English. So you could use that dictionary to theoretically translate anything that didn't go beyond that 40,000 words in the dictionary. The second piece of evidence is he did develop translations of texts that he presented in Basic English. One of which was Finnegan's Wake by James Joyce, which I guess he did as kind of a joke or something, because James Joyce actually wrote that book at the same time in multiple different languages. So he just said, oh, let me just extend this into my own iteration of English. And if you've ever used Simple English Wikipedia, so that's derived from Basic English. It's not precisely the same, but I guess the concepts and the teaching philosophy that Ogden developed was later represented in Simple English. Okay, so this is the Lord's Prayer in the Standard on the right and Simple English on the left. So, Our Father in heaven, may your name be kept holy. Let your kingdom come. Let your pleasure be done, as in heaven, so on earth. Give us this day our bread for our needs, and make us free of our debts, as we have made free those who are in debt to us. And let us not be put to the test, but keep us safe from the evil one. Okay, that maybe doesn't have the same zing to it, but that basically conveys the meaning, I would say. And here are some examples of his translation of Finnegan's Wake. So I haven't read any James Joyce, but actually it's quite obtruse. I can't understand what this is saying, so if you don't understand this, that's not your fault. It's difficult. So here's the first line here. Joyce, wait till the honeying of the loon, love. Die, Eve, little Eve, die. Ogden, do not go up till the moon is up, love. She's dead, little Eve, she's dead. Eve, she's dead. Okay, Edward Thorndike created the first limmatized word frequency lists in 1932. So up to this point, people had been experimenting with various methods of trying to measure vocabulary. And in order to give a more modern, systematic way of measuring people's vocabulary, it was necessary to use these limmatized word lists. So even though Ogden came up with the idea of a limmatized word list, that idea didn't really fully catch on really until like the 1960s. But what Thorndike did was he took various pieces of text and he just counted the number of repetitions of a certain word until he came up with word lists. And so I think you can see the importance of this to language education. Almost every language curriculum in some concept has an idea of frequency, as you should learn the more frequent words first. I think actually maybe we over-rely on frequency. What Ogden did was, it's kind of like prescriptive versus descriptive. So if I'm saying this is the most frequent words, I'm just describing to you empirically these are the most frequently used words. But there's a lot of problems associated with that, which I'll talk about in a minute if I remember to. However, prescriptively, Ogden used his own analysis and his own subjective opinion to say, maybe this isn't the most frequent word, but it has a function that can be used to describe other words. Do you see where I'm going with this? So even though Ogden's prescriptive idea of basic words is in some ways, I think, more sophisticated, but actually that fell out of favor. And it hasn't been in favor. It's, he created that over 100 years ago, and I think that we mostly focus on word frequency lists. Nevertheless, in terms of our third perennial question, word frequency is an important approach as far as how to obtain knowledge of vocabulary. You can't get away from word frequency. And I lost my train of thought. Okay. Yeah, these frequency lists from various sources, that is one issue with word frequency lists, because if you look at two separate sources, you're gonna get radically different ideas of word frequency. So later in a minute, I'm going to show you a word frequency list that is derived from Wikipedia, and I was looking at that. I was looking at the 2000 level words, and like 2004 and 2008 were like something and somebody. Okay, so wouldn't you think that something is a bit more basic than at the 2000 level? I'm an English teacher. I teach the word something like that's in my top 50, frankly, because that's just a replacement pronoun. However, if you're looking at Wikipedia articles, they tend to enumerate their nouns. They don't use the noun pronoun, even though it has a very fundamental and basic meaning. And so something that Edward Thorndike was able to recognize from doing this research is that the vast majority of speech and writing is derived from a relatively small set of words. For example, Franklin Roosevelt's 1932 acceptance speech was 70% drawn from a set of only 500 words. Okay, So Lee Cronbach, who's most famously known for Cronbach's Alpha, actually had a contribution to the development of vocabulary research. And it wasn't so much that he was the first person to investigate this particular contribution, but because he's a famous name and this paper was well referenced at the time. I did find a paper in 1942 where he was focusing on the different methods of testing vocabulary size. And so do you see how I said that these ideas develop sequentially? What is a word? How do you measure knowledge and how do you gain knowledge? So you have to answer those questions sequentially, because how do you measure word knowledge level if you don't know how to define a word? So I thought that it was interesting that not only do most papers that, maybe not most, but a great many papers that deal with vocabulary acquisition recapitulate this same these same three questions, usually in that order, but also the history developed in kind of that sequential fashion, because one question is sort of the prerequisite of another. So you can kind of see how the earlier researchers were more focused on how to define a word, and in the middle of the 20th century, they started to become more interested in how to measure word knowledge. And even at this time, they were still doing, like, every single word is a separate word, like go and goes is a separate word. And when you measure vocabulary that way, you end up with a vocabulary knowledge size of, like, in the hundreds of thousands, and that's very cumbersome. And also, it doesn't really reflect the way that people think. People think, okay, go and goes, those aren't separate words. Those are two variations of the same word. I always get out of breath whenever I talk about, yeah, but I'm excited. I'm not nervous. So even as late as 1942, even though this had been a question that had been under research for quite a long time period, actually going back to the 19th century, the earliest vocabulary size measurement research was done by, like, listening to people talk and counting the number of words that they use. But the thing is, we don't use every single word that we know, so obviously that's problematic. But even like 60 years after the initial earliest research on vocabulary size, as shown by this paper by Lee Cronbach, the scientific community was still debating what's the best way to measure word knowledge. But this is also around the time that the scientific community began to agree that limmatized word lists, such as developed by Thorndike, who we looked at previously, are the best way. And actually, these Thorndike word lists continued to be the standard way of measuring word knowledge for, like, until the 1990s. I mean, actually, his basic method is sound, and that's a valid way to measure to gauge vocabulary level. Okay, so I sort of ran out of time for the most recent. Oh wait, actually, I do want to continue here. Okay, introduction part 2. Dialogue and drama, 2 ways of viewing language learning. So now I want to cycle back towards the dichotomy between prickly people and gooey people, or rigorous people versus organic people. And I just wanted to highlight a little bit of a controversy that began in the 1980s and is still continuing to this day by highlighting the profile of some currently active vocabulary researchers. So this is Stephen Krashen, who wrote Principles and Practice in Second Language Acquisition, which, if you're interested in language acquisition, it's actually a very fascinating book. But he tends to be a gooey type person. So let's look at this quote. So I edited this out, but he said, "Some believe vocabulary should be taught in context rather than by rote memorization of a list. It may even be the case that vocabulary should not be taught directly at all." And he went on to say, "Competence in spelling and vocabulary is most efficiently attained by comprehensible input in the form of reading." That's from a 1989 article where he reaffirmed his position. The best way to learn vocabulary is just to introduce yourself to it, immerse yourself to reading material, and don't study these stuffy vocabulary word lists. However, Paul Nation, who's another kind of micro-celebrity in the vocabulary research community, he does advocate for direct vocabulary learning and learning directly from flashcards and word lists. So he said in 2001, many teachers and writers about vocabulary learning see the direct study of vocabulary, not immediately connected to a particular text, as being opposed to learning from context and thus dismiss it. He later went on to say, direct vocabulary study is a way of speeding up the learning process. So I tend to be more on the Paul Nation side. I think it's very beneficial to study from word lists. And one thing that I will say is everybody who says you should study from word lists all agree you also need to incorporate organic listening and reading and speaking exercises. But these organic people who say don't study vocabulary lists, a good many of them say never study from vocabulary lists. So I think that this is kind of, the organic side tends to lend itself to extremist opposition to any form of rigorous, analytical, systematic, prickly type learning. And also this is very common in second language teachers at all levels. There's all kinds of language teachers who, let me catch my breath, oh my gosh. It's very common for language teachers to have this attitude. And let me tell you a story. When I was in elementary school, we had a Spanish teacher come in, and she would just come in and she would start like singing to us in Spanish and just start talking to us and yelling at us in Spanish. I didn't learn a single thing from that class. So maybe if she had given me like the transcript for the song that she's about to sing, and I could learn the words, and then I could remember it and incorporate those words into my vocabulary. But instead, it was just a bunch of incomprehensible input. So I have a little bit of a grudge against these organic type learners. Also, when I was a language teacher, just recently at a Hawkwand, like my boss would act like I was killing the kids if I gave them vocabulary lists, or if I just gave a translation. It's like, oh, you can't give a translation. You need to show them a picture and do a little dance, and that's how the language is learned. Da, 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 da. Well, no, how about I just give a translation? So as I'll talk about later, it's perfect common sense. The fastest way to learn a word is just give them a translation. It takes 2 seconds, and in many cases, it doesn't even need to be repeated. They'll just absorb it immediately. That also depends on the type of word. For example, people learn concrete nouns very quickly. So if I just say, oh, that animal, that's a cat. People can remember that very quickly. Like our brains are just hardwired to pick up that kind of information. Also, action nouns like, run, jump. Sort of concrete adjectives like tall, short, fast, slow. Whereas more abstract words, they don't get learned as quickly. And another problem with this no definition, organic, just immerse yourself approach is it's very hard to define something abstract without just giving you the word. You know what I mean? I can show you a picture of, oh, this is a cat, this is a dog, this is an elephant. I can't show you a picture of the word process. Like, how do you visualize that? It's much better to just say process. That's kwadong, okay? That's a much more efficient way to learn that type of word. Okay. Yeah, so anyway, we were talking about this dispute between Krashen and Nation is in favor of word lists. Okay. Later, Tom Cobb piped in, and he is in support of Nation's hypothesis. So he's Team Prickly, and he said, it is only with recent development of computer technology that the extreme unlikelihood of developing adequate vocabulary through reading alone has been demonstrated. So according to him, research shows that you just can't get enough vocabulary from reading alone. Okay, so Krashen and McQuillan responded to this. So Krashen is the teacher and McQuillan is the student. And as you can see here, he's actually kind of a micro-celebrity. So this video on YouTube had 645,000 views, and this is only 7 months ago. And I did not watch this video, but this little quote here, that's a waste of time. What do you think he's talking about? He's probably talking about vocabulary word lists. That's a waste of time. Just immerse yourself into the language. Just do organic reading and listening practices. So now we've gone all the way from 1982 to the present year that this debate has been ongoing. And, okay. So these Krashen and McQuillan, they made a response in 2007 saying, Cobb severely underestimates the impact of free reading on vocabulary development. Okay, and Cobb responded to Krashen and McQuillan saying, an adequate vocabulary from reading alone cannot be done for the majority of learners in a normal time frame. Okay, and here McQuillan responded in 2016. This is a full 8 years after the previous iteration of this dialogue, where he disagrees and said there is an adequate amount of reading material to meet most of the word families from the 2,000 to the 9,000 word range. Okay, so this, as I was saying, this debate has been going on for quite some time. So I a little bit ran out of time to include the most recent information. But Nation, in a book published this year, has said, really both of these things need to happen. And I think this is sensible. Research shows that your vocabulary growth is much, much, much faster from studying from vocabulary word lists. Whereas if you just read, you only pick up like 2 or 3 words an hour or something. I think this is kind of obvious because just like in sports science, you have specific adaptations to specific demands. Okay, so if you're training specifically to acquire words, you're going to acquire a lot of words. However, there's also specific benefits that you get from doing immersive reading. A recent study found that an individual, so this was a case study, one individual did 50 hours of watching movies with English subtitles, and it was found that he increased his reading speed by 30%. And there's been some other research on that area. But basically, you get an independent benefit from doing free reading that is separate from vocabulary acquisition. You actually improve your reading speed. So it's a separate skill, basically. And that makes perfect sense. Okay, so now I want to get into the method and findings part of my presentation. So this is the survey. You can see I'm super, super concerned with having a nice looking presentation for you. Yeah, the part that I scratched out, that is my independent and dependent variable. But, okay, so these 3 survey items I enjoy studying, I'm interested in studying, I'm capable of learning. I grouped those together for a reason, as I'll explain. And I also added an additional survey question that was after I already turned this into you, Professor. I decided to add another survey question just for additional practice. Okay, this slide is out of order. Okay, so the basic experimental design was I was going to put participants into 2 groups. This is slightly different than what I gave in my last presentation, so just feel free to forget about that. You probably don't remember anyway. But group A would be given a contextual study set, followed by a reading comprehension exercise, and group B would be given a different study set followed by this same exercise. So the way that the vocabulary, do you guys use Anki? So this is word learning software, and I think in COM 6000 I said my top free language learning application was ChatGPT, but actually I think Anki beats it out a little bit. This is spaced repetition software, and what this does is it predicts when you're going to forget a word. So this is from a real student of mine. Okay, how do you say Baksa in English? It's PhD. So if he responded, this was hard, but I knew it, then he would see it again in 8 days. And if it was easy, he would see it again in 22 days. And from his full study set, you can see there's a due date here. So the 3rd, the 5th, the 5th, the 5th, the 3rd. Okay. So the idea with spaced repetition is you learn an item, then you review it again, probably the next day, then maybe in 3 days, maybe 7 days, then a month. So the more familiar you get with an item, the less frequently you have to review it. So this is most likely the kind of learning software that I would use for the research participants, although there are other options. But the benefit of this is I didn't want to do a comprehensive vocabulary test at the end of all the sessions. That would just be exhausting and boring and time consuming, because this keeps track of what words that you know and are predicted to be able to remember in real time. So that just takes an entire step out of the experimental process. So, for example, Group A, the context learners would be learning from list red on the left, and the non-context learners would be learning from list blue on the right. And you can see these are balanced for difficulty in terms of frequency rank. So I got all of these from the low 2000s of the Wikipedia vocabulary word list. And this is where I noticed that some very, very common words were nevertheless in the 2000 range. But anyway, and they're also balanced in terms of the number of letters. And so the reading group would, for example, look something like this. So you notice that these are all the words from the context group and none of the words from the no context group. So this experiment would be testing what is the additional benefit of seeing a word that you already know in a reading context. And the reason I think this would be interesting to study is because, as Paul Nation hypothesized, you don't really learn new words from reading. It's more like you reinforce the words that you know. And also you learn how to use them, like grammatically. What words pair with other words? What kind of phrases do these words occur in? And I would hypothesize that you also, being able to see something in context gives you an anchor to help you remember it. So I would expect there to be probably a mild to moderate benefit to long-term word retention if you happen to see a word in context. So I've been learning Korean for like 10 years or something, and I have so many memories of like, oh, I know this word because I saw it in this song, or I know this word because I saw it on a sign or something. Like kideha, that means lean. Like I could never remember that word until I saw a elevator that said kide hadimase or kide kumji. It's like, oh, don't lean. So these contextual cues, these contextual anchors, I would hypothesize that they do help you remember. Okay, here are the results. So I used independent samples t-test to discover that the mean number of learned words from the context group was 148 versus 63 for the no context group. Okay, obviously fake data. That's probably exaggerated from what we would actually see, but yeah, we'll go with that. And so there was no homogeneity of variance. Wait, isn't that bad? I did actually want to ask you about that because the Levine's test came up with a no homogeneity of variance, and I think that's supposed to be a bad thing, but one of the tutorials said that if your sample size is above 60 or so, it doesn't matter.
So can you go to this slide? I just want to show you. So mean is higher than this one, but when you see the standard deviation, it's much higher than this one. And can you go to the next one? Because their standard deviation is too different from each other, the difference is significant. That means their variance is not equal. So that is why you have to read this line, the second line. So yeah, it is not great because t-test assume that equal variance. However, still there's a lot of way to overcome the problem. This is one of the ways we can overcome the problem. By reading the second line instead of the first line, we can do that. When you see the DF, DF means degree of freedom. So Louis had, I think, 50 students.
Yes, it was.
And then there are two groups. So 50 minus 1 is 48. This is accurate number. When you see the degree of freedom, this is not 48 because SPSS automatically changed the degree of freedom because of the equal variance was not assumed. So you don't need to watch about it. Well, yeah, it is okay in the SPSS.
Okay. Okay, that's good to know.
Yeah.
Okay, also there were some correlations between the survey responses and the dependent variable, which was total number of words learned. So there was a negative 0.217 correlation with age, so a negative correlation with age, meaning older people learned less words. And I was actually curious how to interpret this also. What exactly does negative 0.217 mean? Does that mean like per year they learned on average 2 less words, or what does that mean?
It's a 1 unit increase of age means 1 unit decrease, a 0.217 decrease of the learn. But you don't need to worry about that means, but you can see 0.2, that is a weak correlation between these two variables. So when you go back to our slide, I saw that strong correlation, moderate correlation, and weak correlation. This is kind of weak correlation. However, weak correlation doesn't mean that it is not significant or significant. You need to read this p-value. P-value is higher than 0.05. That means although there is a negative relationship, this relationship is not significant statistically. So we can say, of course, as age increases, learned words decrease. However, the relationship is not significant.
I see. And let's see. Males learned more words, but don't blame me. I didn't make up this data. I got this data from you. So, yeah.
Yeah.
And so I decided it would be interesting to manipulate the data a little bit because I thought I included like 3 survey items that related to confidence, like I'm interested in learning, I'm capable of learning, or something like that. So I thought most likely those 3 survey responses are going to correlate together. So I kind of manipulated the data to make sure they actually did correlate. And I created a composite variable using, well, I don't remember how I did it, but basically I looked up a tutorial, and there's some relatively straightforward way to take the average of the 3 variables and combine them together to create a single composite variable. And then using the composite variable to correlate with the number of learned words, the dependent variable, there was a 0.832 correlation, which is highly significant. I also added just for extra practice, I wanted to say, well, let's say that there's a positive correlation for enjoyment of lessons, but only among women and not among men. So the way that you can do that is you do something called define something something. What did I do? Analyze. Shucks, I can't remember, but there's just a way to exclude males, then correlate the enjoyment of lessons, then exclude females, and generate the correlation with the dependent variable. That I just did that for some extra practice. But yeah, so among males, the correlation with the dependent variable was 0.065, and among females was 0.674. So probably a little bit exaggerated there, but yeah, that's my presentation. And in the past semester, I never quite liked studying language, but the research that I've been reading has reaffirmed my belief that it is very valuable to study from word lists, and I find that to be quicker and enjoyable. I would love to just sit down for 1 hour and knock out 30 words, or sit down for 3 hours and knock out 100 words. Okay, you're gonna learn a new language in no time that way. And another very interesting hypothesis that some researchers have been talking about is pretty much your word knowledge is a proxy for your total language. So if this person is fluent, they know a lot of words, and if this person doesn't know a lot of words, they are not fluent. There's no way around it. So that leads to the question is, can you just brute force your way through a language and just learn words? Don't even worry about listening, reading exercises, and all this. I mean, this hasn't been studied, but how many times have you had some kind of a grammatical issue or listening issue, and you just learned so many words that you just brute force overcame that issue? That's something that I'll be thinking about moving forward in the future. So I hope that you got maybe a little bit of inspiration or something like that from that lecture. So does anybody have any questions? All right.